The casket was already closed when I arrived. I stood in the doorway of Hargrove and Sons Funeral Home and took in the room, the white lilies, the soft organ music, the cluster of people in dark clothes who had loved my son far more recently than I had. My grandson Thomas spotted me from across the room and looked away. That told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. I found a seat near the back, close to the exit. The way you sit when you're not sure if you belong somewhere, which I didn't. Not really, not anymore. My son, Daniel, had been dead for 60 days. I'd found out from his attorney's office, not from family. A woman in a black sheath dress caught my eye from the front row. My daughter-in-law, Renee. She gave me the kind of smile you give a stranger who's wandered into the wrong wedding. Polite, thin, and over and under a second. Beside her sat my grandson Thomas, 23 and already built like his grandfather, and my granddaughter Priya, who had her father's eyes and her mother's composure. Neither of them had called me. Not when Daniel got sick, not when he passed, not to tell me the service was Wednesday at 2 o'clock. I had called the attorney's office myself after a neighbor of Daniel's, a kind woman named Gloria, who used to send me Christmas cards, left a message on my machine. I was 64 years old, sitting in the back pew at my own son's funeral, and I had learned of his death from a neighbor. That was the state of things between us. I won't pretend I didn't understand why. I understood perfectly. I had made choices years ago that Daniel never forgave. Choices I made because I believed they were right, because I believed I was protecting him, and because I loved someone who turned out not to deserve that kind of love. By the time I realized all of that, the damage was done. Daniel had built his life around a version of me that was easier to hate than to understand. I had let him, because I didn't know how to explain myself without destroying what little remained between us. The service lasted 40 minutes. The pastor spoke about legacy and grace. Thomas gave a eulogy that made half the room cry. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and watched my son's family grieve together, a unit, a whole thing. And I felt the particular loneliness of someone standing outside a lit window in the cold. Afterward, Renee approached me in the parking lot. She was still impeccable. Not a hair out of place, mascara intact, which I had always suspected required a kind of discipline I lacked. Eleanor, she said, stopping a careful distance away. Renee, I held my car keys in both hands. I'm sorry for your loss. He was a good man. He was, she agreed. Then she said, the reading is Thursday, 11 o'clock, Hargrove, Walsh, and Brennan on Clement Street. She paused. He wanted you there. I looked at her. That surprised me. He left instructions, she said, in a tone that made clear the instructions had also surprised her. Then she turned and walked back toward her children. And I stood in the parking lot of Hargrove and Sons with my keys in my hands and the November wind cutting right through my coat. I didn't sleep well the 2 nights before Thursday. I lay in the dark in my house. The same house I'd lived in for 31 years, the one Daniel had grown up in before everything fell apart. And I thought about what Renee had said. He wanted you there, after 11 years of near silence, after birthday cards returned unopened, after a Christmas 3 years ago when I drove 4 hours to his house and sat in my car for 40 minutes before driving home because I couldn't make myself ring the bell. He wanted me there. I didn't let myself hope for anything specific. I was 64 years old, and I had learned at considerable cost what hope without evidence tends to produce. The offices of Hargrove, Walsh, and Brennan were on the third floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. The receptionist led me to a conference room where Renee and Thomas and Priya were already seated on one side of a long mahogany table. There were 2 chairs on the other side. I took one. The other remained empty. Thomas stared at the table. Priya glanced at me once, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not warmth exactly, but not hostility either. Something more like curiosity. Renee looked at her phone. We did not speak. The attorney, a measured man in his late 50s named Mr. Walsh, entered and set a leather portfolio on the table. He had silver at his temples and the manner of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times it had become a kind of careful craft. "Thank you all for being here," he said. Before I read the will itself, Daniel asked that I read a letter. A personal statement he prepared approximately 4 months ago. He looked up. He was very specific about this. The letter first, then the will. Renee straightened slightly. Thomas looked up from the table. Mr. Walsh opened the portfolio and lifted several pages, and I recognized Daniel's handwriting on the first one. Neat, deliberate, left-leaning. And something tightened in my chest so fast I had to press my feet flat against the floor to stay composed. Mr. Walsh cleared his throat and began to read. "I am writing this because I am dying, and I have spent too much of my life being a coward about the truth. I want the record corrected before I'm not here to correct it. When I was 19 years old, my father, Gerald Marsh, was investigated for financial fraud. The investigation was serious. The evidence was substantial. He stood to lose everything: his business, his freedom, most likely 15 to 20 years of his life. He was guilty. I want to be clear about that because I was not clear about it for a long time. My father was guilty of every charge. My mother, Eleanor Marsh, knew this. She also knew something the investigators did not, and that my father's business partner, a man named Howard Cliff, had been the architect of the entire scheme, and that my father had participated out of fear of Howard, not greed. This distinction mattered legally. My father's attorney believed it could have reduced his sentence significantly. My mother went to Howard Cliff. I don't know exactly what was said. I was 19 and nobody told me anything. What I know is that a deal was made. Howard had connections. Howard had lawyers my father's public defender couldn't compete with, and Howard agreed to use those connections to make certain evidence disappear, to ensure my father's sentence was reduced to 18 months with the possibility of parole, on one condition. The condition was that my mother would sign a statement confirming that she had been aware of the fraud, that she had helped conceal certain transactions, and that she accepted responsibility for her involvement. It was not true. My mother had no involvement in the fraud. She signed a false confession to save my father from a longer sentence. She received 3 years of probation, a criminal record, and the complete destruction of her professional reputation. She lost her nursing license. She lost her standing in the community. She lost eventually her marriage because my father, once released, was so consumed by shame and what I now understand was an inability to face what she had done for him. that he left and she lost me. Because nobody told me any of this. Not my father, who I lived with after the divorce, and who let me believe my mother had been complicit in something shameful. Not Howard Cliff, who moved away and prospered. Not my mother, who, and this is the part I have struggled most to understand, and to have finally, in the last months of my life, come to accept, did not tell me because she was afraid I would try to do something about it. And she had decided, for reasons I believe were entirely about love and entirely wrong-headed, that my father's comfort and my stability were worth more than her reputation in my eyes. I found out the truth 14 months ago. I found a letter in my father's things after his death. A letter Howard Cliff wrote to my father in 1987, 1 year after the arrangement, which made the entire situation clear. I confronted the documentation. I hired an independent attorney to verify what I was reading. And then I sat with what I had done to my mother for 11 years, and I did not know how to survive it. I called her. We spoke 3 times. She told me she did not blame me. I did not believe her, and then slowly I began to. She is the most honest person I have ever known, which is something it took me 43 years and a terminal diagnosis to properly understand. I'm leaving this letter because I want my children to know who their grandmother is. I want my wife to understand why I have structured my estate the way I have. And I want it on record, whatever record this room constitutes, that Eleanor Marsh is a woman who sacrificed her own name to protect someone who did not deserve it, and who endured years of silence from her only child rather than burden that child with a truth that would have complicated his life. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. I'm sorry I didn't ring the bell. I love you. Daniel. The room was very quiet when Mr. Walsh set down the last page. I was looking at the surface of the mahogany table. I was aware that my hands were trembling, which they had not done in years, not since the probation period, when I used to sit in my car outside the probation office and talk myself into going in. I pressed them flat against my thighs. Thomas made a sound I had never heard from him before. A short, sharp intake of breath, like he'd stepped on something unexpected in the dark. Priya had both hands over her mouth. Renee was looking at me. I couldn't read her face completely. There was something in it that might have been recognition, or might have been grief, or might have been both at once. Mr. Walsh gave us a moment. Then he said gently, "Shall I continue?" Nobody said no. He opened to the second section of the portfolio and began to read the will. Daniel's estate was not enormous. He had been a high school history teacher for 19 years, which is a calling, not a path to wealth. But he had been careful with money, the way people who grow up around financial disaster tend to be. There was the house in Sacramento, the retirement accounts, a modest investment portfolio, and a life insurance policy he had apparently maintained and never mentioned. To Thomas, he left the house and the majority of the retirement accounts, with instructions about how to manage them that ran to a full additional page. To Priya, he left the investment portfolio and a box of letters he had apparently written to her over the past 4 months, which Mr. Walsh produced from a desk drawer and slid across the table. Priya put both hands on it and did not open it. To Renee, he left the contents of their joint accounts and a personal letter, which Mr. Walsh indicated was sealed and private. Then, Mr. Walsh looked at me over the top of his reading glasses and said, "To my mother, Eleanor Jean Marsh, I leave the full value of my life insurance policy in the amount of $412,000 with no conditions and no restrictions. Additionally, I leave her my father's watch, the one he never came back for, because she should have something of his that costs him something even now. I leave her my journals from the last 14 months, which she has not read and which I hope will help her understand that the time we lost was not wasted on my end. I was thinking of her during all of it. I was trying to find my way back. I found it too late and not late enough, which I understand makes no sense and which I believe she will understand perfectly." Mr. Walsh set down the pages. $412,000. I had not expected anything. I had dressed carefully on Thursday morning, the way you do when you want to show respect, taken the bus because I didn't trust myself to drive, sat in this chair because Daniel had asked me to be here. I had brought no expectations with me. I had packed them all away 11 years ago, like things that take up too much room. "Mrs. Marsh," Mr. Walsh said, and his voice was kind. "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said, then, because it wasn't entirely true, "I'm not sure." There was movement across the table. I looked up. Priya had stood. She was 20 years old, my granddaughter, a person I had last seen in photographs, and she was walking around the end of the mahogany table. She stopped beside my chair and stood there for a moment, and then she crouched down to my level and looked at me with her father's eyes. "Grandma," she said, just that. Just the word. I had not been called that in 11 years. And the sound of it, the ordinary, unremarkable, completely devastating sound of it, broke something open in me that I hadn't known was still sealed. She put her arms around my shoulders, and I let her. And I held on to my granddaughter in the offices of Hargrove, Walsh, and Brennan on Clement Street. And I did not try to hold back what came because I was 64 years old and I had been holding things back for a very long time. And Daniel, in the end, had seen to it that I didn't have to anymore. Thomas came around the table next. He stood behind his sister and he put one hand on my shoulder, a careful touch, the way young men do when they're not sure how to do something, but they've decided to do it anyway. I reached up and put my hand over his. Renee remained in her chair. I didn't blame her. She had her own grief and her own adjustments to make, and she had been married to a man who had kept something significant from her for 14 months. And that required its own kind of processing that had nothing to do with me. We stayed like that for a while. Then Mr. Walsh cleared his throat very softly and said he'd give us some privacy, and he left the room. Later, I couldn't have said how much later, Priya sat in the chair beside me and said, "I want to hear about him. When he was young. When things were different." "I can tell you a lot," I said. "I have time." "We have time," she said, and looked at her brother. And Thomas nodded once, still standing, still with his hand on the back of my chair. I thought about the house on Clement Street, about the watch I would take home in my coat pocket, about 14 months of journals I hadn't read yet. I thought about a 19-year-old boy who had grown up to be a man who left letters, who told the truth when it mattered, who had found his way back even if the path had taken too long. I had signed my name to something false 44 years ago to keep a man I loved from losing everything. I had lost most things anyway, not all at once, but slowly, in the way that's harder to see coming. My license, my reputation, my marriage, my son's belief in me. I had rebuilt what I could. I had made myself a life that was smaller than the one I'd planned, but not empty. A garden in the back, a book club on Tuesdays, a neighbor named Gloria who sent Christmas cards and left messages when it mattered. I had learned to take satisfaction in small things because the alternative was bitterness. And bitterness, I had observed, tends to eat through whatever it's stored in. I hadn't expected anything more than that. Daniel had left me journals. He had left me $412,000. He had left me a watch that his father never came back for, which was, I thought, probably the most honest gift anyone had ever given me. And he had left me sitting in that conference room with his children on either side of me, something I hadn't dared to name until just then. A way back in, not to the years that were gone. Those were gone, and I had no illusions about reconstructing them. But to this, a granddaughter asking to hear stories about her father as a boy, a grandson standing behind my chair with his hand on the back of it, steady, uncertain, present. A room that still smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper, which somehow made it feel more real, not less. I thought about something Daniel had written, which Mr. Walsh had read aloud, which I already knew I would turn over in my mind for a long time. I found my way back too late and not late enough. He was right that it made no sense. He was right that I understood it perfectly. On the bus ride home, I held the watch in my hand. It was Gerald's, old, heavy, the second hand still moving. Gerald had worn it every day for 20 years and then left it on the nightstand when he went. The way he'd left a number of other things: a closet of clothes, a coffee mug with his name on it, a son who grew up in his house and learned to see the world in the shape his father described. I didn't feel angry holding it. I had been angry for a long time in the years after the divorce, when I was alone with my probation appointments and my revoked license and my son's silence. The anger had been real and it had been justified, and eventually it had burned down to something quieter, the way fires do. What I felt holding the watch on the bus home was something close to peace. The specific kind of peace that comes not from things being fixed. Many things were not fixed, many things could not be, but from the truth being finally, fully in the room. Someone knew. Daniel had known, in the end. His children would know. Mr. Walsh had a file with a signed letter in it, and somewhere in that file, the real story lived, attached to my real name. That was not nothing. That was, I thought, watching Sacramento move past the bus window in the gray November light, quite a lot. I got off at my stop and walked the 4 blocks home. The garden was dead for the season, which I'd known and still found slightly startling every year, the way you do with things you know intellectually but experience with your whole body. I unlocked the front door and went inside and put the watch on the kitchen table. I made coffee. I sat down. I had today, and I intended to use it. Priya had asked if she could call, and I had given her my number. My actual number, not the landline I kept for habit, but the cell phone, the one I carried. Thomas had asked, with a formality that reminded me powerfully of Daniel at the same age, if he might come by sometime to see the house. I had said yes. I had meant it. Renee had not spoken to me directly again, but as I was leaving, she had paused at the elevator and said quietly, "He talked about you the last few months. I thought you should know." Then the elevator had opened and she had stepped in, and I had stood in the hallway for a moment before walking to the stairs. "He talked about you." I drank my coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was brown and still and waiting for whatever came next, which it would do with or without my help, the way gardens do. I reached across the table and picked up the watch and held it in my palm, the weight of it familiar somehow, even though I had not held it before. The second hand moved. It had kept on moving for 44 years through everything, and it was moving now. And I thought that was, all things considered, the right thing for a watch to do. I set it down gently and got up to find something to eat. I had people to call. I had journals to read. I had a granddaughter who wanted to know what her father was like at 7 years old. How he used to line up his toy cars by color, not by size, and how he cried at the end of Charlotte's Web and then denied it, and how he learned to ride his bike in this exact driveway on a Tuesday in June with the whole summer still ahead of him. I knew all of it. I had been there for all of it. And now, finally, I had someone to tell.